Have you ever wondered how a bunch of colonies, scattered along the Atlantic coast, decided to take on the mightiest empire on Earth? It wasn't just about taxes and tea. A huge part of the story, a part that's often overlooked, was happening right on the pages of their local newspapers. Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how early American newspapers lit the fuse of the Revolution. Before the 1760s, newspapers in the American colonies were pretty tame. They mostly printed shipping news, local gossip, and reprinted articles from London. They were small, often just a single sheet folded in half, and run by printers who relied on government contracts to stay in business. Speaking out against the crown? That was a quick way to lose your livelihood, or worse, end up in jail for seditious libel. The idea of a free press, as we know it, didn't really exist yet. The goal was to inform, but not necessarily to persuade or challenge authority. But then came the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a game changer. The British government decided to impose a direct tax on all printed materials in the colonies' newspapers: pamphlets, legal documents, even playing cards. For colonial printers, this wasn't just a political issue. It was a direct attack on their wallets and their very profession. Suddenly, they had skin in the game. Their financial survival was now tied to the cause of colonial resistance. This is when we see the tone of American newspapers begin to shift dramatically. Printers who were once cautious suddenly became bold. They began publishing fiery essays, scathing political cartoons, and passionate letters from readers arguing against taxation without representation. Newspapers like the Boston Gazette became epicenters of radical thought. It was in these pages that writers using pseudonyms like Samuel Adams laid out the intellectual arguments for liberty. They weren't just reporting the news anymore, they were actively shaping it. Let's talk about the power of the printed word back then. In an age without internet or television, the local newspaper was the primary source of information. A single copy might be passed around an entire village or read aloud in a tavern, reaching dozens, if not hundreds, of people. These papers created a shared sense of identity and grievance among the colonies. A farmer in Georgia could read about the protests in Boston and feel a connection, a sense that they were all in this together. Newspapers were the social media of the 18th century, creating a united network of dissent. One of the most effective tools they used was propaganda, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They were masters at crafting a narrative. Take the Boston Massacre in 1770. The event itself was chaotic and confusing. But newspapers, particularly in Boston, framed it as a deliberate, brutal slaughter of innocent colonists by cruel British soldiers. Paul Revere's famous engraving, which was widely reprinted in newspapers, showed an organized line of redcoats firing on a helpless crowd. It was a powerful piece of visual propaganda that inflamed anti-British sentiment across the colonies. It simplified a complex event into a clear story of good versus evil, victim versus oppressor. Newspapers also served as a vital organizational tool for the patriot cause. Committees of correspondence, which were basically networks of patriot leaders in different colonies, used newspapers to communicate with each other and to coordinate their actions. When the British closed the port of Boston as punishment for the Tea Party, newspapers up and down the coast printed appeals for aid. They published lists of donations from other colonies, showing solidarity and encouraging others to contribute. They announced boycotts of British goods and publicly shamed merchants who didn't comply, using social pressure to enforce the resistance effort. Of course, not every printer was a patriot. There were loyalist newspapers, too, like James Rivington's New York Gazetteer. They defended the king and parliament and painted the revolutionaries as dangerous, lawless rabble-rousers. This created a fierce war of words. Patriot and loyalist printers would attack each other in print, calling each other liars, traitors, and fools. These press wars were incredibly important because they forced ordinary people to choose a side. You couldn't just be neutral when your local paper was filled with passionate arguments from both camps. You had to read, think, and decide where you stood. As tensions escalated into open warfare after 1775, the role of newspapers became even more critical. They were the primary way people got news from the front lines. General Washington understood this. He made sure his army had printers and made a point to get his official dispatches and battlefield reports into the papers as quickly as possible. He knew that maintaining public morale was just as important as winning battles. When the Continental Army was starving at Valley Forge, newspapers published appeals for supplies and printed stories of patriotic sacrifice to keep spirits up on the home front. And perhaps the most famous example of the press's influence is Thomas Paine's Common Sense. While technically a pamphlet, not a newspaper, its success was fueled by the newspaper network. It was advertised, reviewed, and excerpted in papers throughout the colonies. Common Sense made a radical, clear, and powerful argument for complete independence from Britain, something many people hadn't seriously considered before. It was written in plain, accessible language, and the newspapers helped its message spread like wildfire, convincing countless Americans that breaking away was not just an option, but a necessity. So, when we look back at the American Revolution, it's easy to focus on the generals and the politicians. But we can't forget the printers, people like Benjamin Eads of the Boston Gazette or John Dunlap in Philadelphia who first printed the Declaration of Independence. These printers took immense personal and financial risks. They used their presses to transform isolated protests into a unified continental movement. They weaponized information, building a shared American identity and convincing a diverse population that they had a common cause worth fighting and dying for. They weren't just recording the revolution, they were helping to create it one inked page at a time. Next time you read the news, remember this powerful legacy. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. See you next time.